people have very expansive free speech rights in the United States generally, and California in particular, and especially as that relates to the content of speech. By and large, there are very few things that you say that could be subject to any kind of punishment. And that includes not only the right to advocate around US government policy and policy of the government of Israel, policies of other institutions, but also to say things that other people might find offensive, right? I mean, you have a right to engage in stereotypic language if you choose to. You have a right to say that you think all people from Norway are stupid and that people from Denmark are smarter than people from Norway. You have a right to share the idea that people who are Italians are cheapskates and that people from Germany are inherently violent. That's part of your free speech rights. You can say that all cops are bastards, and you can say that all government, including university administrators, are corrupt and narrow-minded. And you can say that understanding that you cannot be punished for that speech. The content of speech is protected under the California as well as the United States Constitution. Everyone has heard about the First Amendment. The First Amendment, what probably a lot of people do not know, is the First Amendment protects you from the actions of your government, okay? And that's important to keep in mind. But when we talk about your government, that means any public agency of your government, whether it's the United States government, the state of California government, the city and county of San Francisco government, the University of California government, including the UCSF government, the chancellor and all the officials at UCSF are government officials for purposes of the First Amendment. And they do not have the right to punish you or to threaten you with punishment because of your exercise of your right to free speech under the US Constitution. What people are probably less understanding of is that the California Constitution and its Article 1, Section 2, Subdivision A of the California Constitution also protects your right to free speech. But what is really great, at least from my point of view, about the California Constitution is that it not only protects people from violations of their free speech by the government, but it provides those same protections in a private setting as well. So, for example, and I'm not sure if anyone is on this call tonight who is a student, for example, or a faculty member at a private college, whether it's Stanford University or the University of San Francisco. The California Constitution protects people's free speech rights from retaliation or repression by private actors as well as government actors. So if you are a student or an employee, faculty member, or any other employee working for a private university or college or a private company, whether we're talking about, Google or Starbucks or any other private company, you have a right under the California Constitution to free speech and to exercise that right without threat or punishment. And there are specific laws in California that provide access to the courts for persons whose free speech rights have been infringed by private actors as well as government actors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to talk a lot about courts and their various competing jurisdictions. One thing that lawyers and legal people need to keep in mind, and I don't think that others especially need to, is that there are limits that the federal courts have for entertaining damages lawsuits against the state or its subsidiary entities. And that's because of the 11th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 11th Amendment, probably not one of everyone's best known or favorite amendments, but basically what it does is it protects the state from having to answer lawsuits in federal court. And that comes up on various occasions. People will go into a federal court and sue the University of California for violations of free speech or other constitutional rights. And they're surprised when their cases are thrown out because the University of California is a state entity, as is California State University, as are, and this is often surprising to people, California public schools, K-12 school districts, the San Francisco the San Francisco School District is considered a state entity because of state oversight regulation of the public schools, and therefore the public school districts are exempt from suit or immunized from suit for damages in the federal courts. Not to worry, though, because employees of state entities, just like anyone else, can sue for violations of their civil rights, including their free speech rights, in state courts. So even though you might be suing under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, you could sue your state public entity in state court for violations of your constitutional rights under federal law as well as under state law. And that all creates a lot of confusion that we don't have to untangle today, except to the extent to which people have questions. But it does create, the anomaly that if the city and county of San Francisco or the county of Alameda or the city of Oakland or the municipal transit district or whomever violates your free speech rights, you can go into federal court or state court. But if you work for a state agency, you have to go into state court. Jess, it seemed like you were about to ask a question.
Yeah, a quick question in terms of the definition of speech. Does that in fact include digital speech? Can you just maybe flesh out a little bit what speech is legally?
When we talk about speech content, that can be oral speech, that could be written speech, it could be speech on the internet, it can be speech in a publication of any kind, it can be speech in a play, in a movie, in any form that you could possibly imagine. I'm sure forms that I can't imagine, but that people today can. But yes, we're talking about content of speech.
Content of speech. And I don't know if this is going to come up later, but I just want to put it on your radar. Speech at work versus speech outside of work. Any distinction there?
not in terms of content. Okay. And the other thing, though, that I want to keep in mind is that I'm not simply talking about speech, right? The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the California Constitution protect the right to assemble, right? You right to assemble, have a protest, have a rally, have a meeting. It's Those are rights that are under the First Amendment. The right to petition your government, and that includes the government of the University of California at San Francisco. That is considered a government agency. So people have a right to present their demands, their concerns to their government, whether that has to do with course content or opposition to what some of your government officials may be saying publicly, whether it's the president of the University of California, you mentioned Michael Drake, or the chancellor, UCSF, Sam Hawgood, or even the chair of the Department of Medicine, or the chair of the Department of Psychiatry, or any other department.
Yeah, I think that's going to be part when we get into the discussion part, because a lot of the anxiety and distress that people do feel right now is around speech at work and being told specifically, you can't talk about that, or don't talk about that, or are being, in some cases, reprimanded and even punished for speaking at work about some of these things.
Well, that probably is a good transition to the second point, because again, there are three criteria you need to think about. And the second one is equal treatment. And what that means is, again, without going through the same collection of government agencies and state and local and so on, or private agencies for purposes of the California Constitution, your employer or your government, because we're talking about speech outside of employment, cannot discriminate against speech on the basis of content. Okay. Now that becomes critically important because there are lots of places, there are lots of situations in workplaces where speech is allowed, but where the people in charge want to crack down on the content of speech and discriminate against speech. So let me give one simple example. Many workplaces, and I'm sure many of your workplaces at UCSF, have bulletin boards. And those bulletin boards are open to individuals, employees, maybe even others, who want to put up notes on the bulletin board and invite people to events, whether it's a social event or whatever kind of event. Come after work to the bar down the street and let's have a conversation about current trends in pathology. Or I have a TV for sale, or my child is selling cookies to raise money for a school trip, or would you like to buy my dog's puppies? If an employer opens up a bulletin board like that and you put up a notice, we're having a protest of Israel's actions in Palestine on Wednesday at 5 p.m. at a certain place, the employer can't say to you that bulletin board is closed to your speech. If it's open to employee speech, then it's open to all employee speech. and there cannot be discrimination. If there is a bulletin that, or a school newspaper that is published by the school and it's open for opinion columns. Someone has an opinion about the Affordable Care Act or trends in psychiatry or some other medical field. And the newspaper publishes that without editorial scrutiny. It's considered an open forum. Then if you want to put an article in that newspaper about the health implications of the war in Gaza, whoever is publishing that newspaper cannot say to you, well, I'm sorry, that's controversial. We're not going to have it. You can continue to write about why people should support or oppose the Affordable Care Act, but we're not open to having a conversation about the impact of what Israel is doing in Gaza.
Well, that's going to end up being a really important point, because that is precisely what is happening in many spaces around speech around Palestine right now. Especially, and the obvious example is, as healthcare professionals or people in public health, for example, we speak about public health implications of violence, of the social determinants of health. We speak about it whenever. In fact, the university made a very vocal statement when Russia invaded Ukraine and attacked hospitals. They were very vocal about it. But now that whole thing has changed, and it's not permissible now. So we'll come back to that, Dan, because that's pretty key in terms of what we're seeing now in healthcare settings and in universities in the state and nationally.
No, and I know that's true, and happy to talk more about it. But at this introductory stage, I think equal treatment is key.
Yeah.
Right. And whatever we're looking at, whether it's a publication, a space on the campus, a kind of free speech space, if there's a cafeteria, and historically people have said, well, again, if you want to talk about this or that, we'll have a table in the cafeteria, please join us. And that's been acceptable, even encouraged by the school authorities. Then they can't say, well, you can have a meeting in the cafeteria to talk about anything except Palestine and Israel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
One thing to keep in mind, though, and it may come back to bite us, is that one way for an institution to solve that, quote, problem is to close the space, right? We've seen a lot of these issues arise in the labor context, in the context of unions attempting to organize workers at a particular workplace and attempting to use things, again, like bulletin boards or cafeterias or, the campus mail, right? Campus mail is a good way to reach people in school districts or universities. So, what you can do, and we call these things in the legal world a public forum. The people who run the forum can close it. It's no longer a public forum, right? It's now, or it's only accessible for matters that are narrowly interpreted as relating to the business of our institution. Now, obviously in a healthcare institution, and as Jess has just explained, that's a big issue, right? I mean, because war or violence or police conduct are public health issues. And so if, to some extent, it might be that the hospital would be cutting off its knows to spite its face, right? By closing
Right.
the forum, because speech that they want to encourage would be swept up.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's such a good point, and many of us are struggling with that because there are educational forums for education at the university and in hospitals and in clinics. We call them rounds, grand rounds, or clinic presentations when we talk about some of these things. And there have been numerous examples when specifically the health negative health effects of what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza has been attempted to be brought up, and it's been shut down. Can't talk about it. Too controversial.
right.
It's too things like that. So that'll be an important point to come back to.
Okay. And then the third big picture point I want to flag are time, place, and conditions rules. Okay. And a time, place, and conditions rule is just what it sounds like. In order for it to be valid, it has to be content neutral, right? It has to be content neutral. But an institution can decide that only certain locations at certain times and under certain conditions can be used for speech. And I'll give you the example that is most important in my life, and it has to do with the free speech movement.
Yeah.
And the free speech movement is probably one of the few modern movements that actually predates me, but it was actually the reason I moved to Berkeley to go to law school. For those who don't remember or don't have it handy, is that students at Berkeley went to the South to do civil rights work and go on freedom rides and things like that in the very early years of the 1960s, and wanted to come back to their campus and organize and reach out to their fellow students and other people on the Berkeley campus. And one of the things that people did was they set up card tables around the campus, and they tried to engage passersby and hand out materials and so on. And the university cracked down on that, and that led to the free speech movement.
Right.
And the result of that were these time, place, and conditions rules that remain in effect today at Cal, and which have been copied at other places. So the university agreed that there are certain places on campus where anyone who wants to, without getting permission in advance, can set up a card table or another table. And the rules got into, well, how big can the table be, right? But tables of a certain size, and they can be staffed all the time, 24/7. If you want to set up a table in Sproul Plaza, you can sit there around the clock and hand out materials. They also, result of that is there could be rallies every day at noon, run in Sproul Plaza with people speaking on the Sproul Hall steps. And I know when I was there was such competition to hold those rallies is that there was a whole sign-up process, because when I was there in law school, there was a rally literally every day. So you had to reserve your spot. And
Wow.
so the spot was Sproul Hall Plaza. Sound equipment could be set up. How powerful the sound equipment was part of the rules, right? You couldn't be heard all over the city, but you could be heard all over Sproul Plaza and places nearby. And the rally was from 10 minutes after 12 till 1 o'clock.
Hmm.
And so those are examples of time, place, and condition rules. The time, the place, the condition being the use of sound equipment of a certain strength. And so a lot of campuses, I don't know about UCSF, but a lot of campuses have rules like that. And those rules are valid rules. And what that would mean, for example, is that if it would be legal for them to say, well, you cannot set up sound equipment outside a classroom building at 10 o'clock in the morning and use that sound equipment, period, and certainly not use it in a way which interfered with classes. But whatever rules that the school implemented, they had to, as I said before, be content neutral and provide equal treatment. Right? So the flip side of what I said is that if there's no rule on the campus that prohibited you as a student or employee from handing out flyers in front of any building, then they have to let you do that unless they change the rules, and it has to be content neutral. So
we had a little incident like that that's kind of interesting, Dan. We found out that at San Francisco General they had a free speech zone, okay? And then we planned a big event, you know, about what was happening in Gaza. The day before the event, a letter came out from the CEO of the hospital, and she basically said, "Oh, big mistake. We took away the free speech zone. You can't have your event." No, she didn't say we couldn't have the event. No events are allowed anymore, basically. Well, we went ahead and did it anyways, and there was a police presence, but they didn't attempt to stop us. But we all felt like that was kind of interesting that it had been an identified free speech zone. But then when word got out that we were doing this event, this letter from the CEO emerged. Is that something they can do?
yes and no, right? I mean, an institution can say, we're going to eliminate our free speech zone, and we're not going to allow any free speech in front of the hospital. We don't care what you're doing or how you're doing it. There'll be no more free speech. And, you know, I suppose there could be some creation of barriers like the benches they set up that you can't sleep on at the airport, or right. You know, places where they put up spikes in the concrete so homeless people cannot sit in the windowsill. But in your case, Jess, that you were spoken about, I think if anyone had been sanctioned for violating that rule, whether it was to be arrested or to get in some kind of employer trouble or student trouble, there could be a pretty persuasive case brought that although this restriction was framed as a content neutral, it was not really, that this free speech zone had been recognized for who knows how many years until people wanted to take advantage of it to give some speech, provide some speech that was supportive of the rights of Palestinians.
That's very interesting. We're about 45 minutes in. People are very interested in the content of what you're saying, Dan. We could go in multiple different directions. I wanted to just check in with you and see where you're at in terms of the content that you wanted to cover so far.
Well, there was one other point that I think fit into what I was just saying.
Okay.
And then I was wanting to make a transition to University of California policies, since I know that that's a concern that many people have.
Yes, please.
Okay. So there's a old, I guess you could say an old saw or an old trope in the world of free speech called the heckler's veto. And it seems to have become recently relevant. And the idea is just kind of what it sounds like, which is that speech can be prohibited because it's going to make somebody mad. And they're going to come and raise some hell about it, or even engage in disruption or even violence. And there's a very old US Supreme Court case called Terminiello versus Chicago, where the US Supreme Court said, no, your right to free speech cannot be infringed upon because it makes someone mad. Okay, so obviously very relevant today.
Yeah.
You know, the government cannot say you are prohibited from engaging in pro-Israeli speech because we're worried that people who are pro the rights of the Palestinians may come and disrupt your speech, or obviously vice versa, right? Which is more our concern here.
But that does happen. But that does happen, actually. It does happen.
I mean, I was, you know, my office, you can't see it right now, but it's right over Oakland City Hall. So I look across the street and there's Oakland City Hall. And there were people lining up last week to urge the city council to pass a resolution in support of the ceasefire and protecting the rights of people in Palestine. And there were some people who supported the Israeli government who came there. I could see them, and I only assume they did because they were carrying Israeli flags. And there was some argument back and forth, right? And the cops were there, and it didn't get to the point where the police intervened. But if they had, it would not have been legal for them to say to the people supporting Palestine, you have to leave because people who don't like your speech are threatening to disrupt it.
Got it.
The government's obligation in a situation like that is to be neutral and is to keep the peace. And if you're having a rally or some other sort of event and people who don't like your speech, and you know, they could be Proud Boys, or you know, we actually have a case that arose during the George Floyd protests in Sacramento, where, in our view, the Sacramento police were giving special privileges to the Proud Boys to come and disrupt the speech of people who were demanding justice for George Floyd. So I'm now going to move on to talking about the university.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the rules are somewhat different for private schools versus public schools, although not so much in California because of the California Constitution. Now, the University of California has lots of rules. And in fact, the handout that I prepared consists of about 5.5 pages of quotations from University of California rules.
Wow.
And so rather than go through the rules at great length, I want to highlight what are some of the concerns, things that people should look out for. So, you know, the University of California is, on paper, very pro-speech, extremely pro-speech. They say in their rules that apply to faculty members, tenured and untenured, staff people, and students is that we will never punish anybody for engaging in free speech. And in fact, we're committed to free speech. And so it's very disturbing to me when we hear that the president or chancellors or department heads are not being true to those principles. And it seems to me that they're getting a lot of pressure. They're getting pressure from very politically influential and very wealthy members of the Board of Regents. Some, not all of whom are Jewish people. Some, not all of whom are, on the record as being extremely supportive of the state of Israel and the Israeli government. But not just those people. But they're getting pressure to suppress speech. And one of the situations that's arisen involves the dean of the UC Berkeley Law School, Edwin Chemerinsky,
Right.
who, generally speaking, is, in my opinion, a great guy, a civil libertarian, a friend of free speech. And he's been put, maybe my saying he's been put is too great an assumption on my part. He is in a situation where he is cracking down on some of the student law journals at the law school. And since my time, the number of those journals has expanded. There's maybe 10 of them now, and they cover a lot of, different specialties, whether it's the rights of African Americans and other people of color, or women's rights, or LGBTQ rights, or environmental issues, and so on. And these journals, by and large, have perspectives that most of us would consider to be progressive. And they, generally speaking, have rights to decide what to publish. But the flip side of that is that students who work on these journals get course credit for it. So working on the journal is effectively, legally, literally, a UC Berkeley law course. And so in a technical, but again, real sense, the publisher of these journals is the Regents of the University of California. And the Regents of the University of California has authority over the rules and regulations that apply to these journals, as well as some authority over their content. So Students for Justice in Palestine, and perhaps some allied organizations, I'm not fully immersed in the details of this, have asked these journals to adopt principles that relate to the rights of Palestinians. And some of the journals have either done so or are considering doing so. And then the question you drill down on is, to what extent can the administration make demands on the journals, and to what extent can the administration decide whether to take away the Regent's stamp of approval and therefore course credit for students who work on the journals. So some interesting issues have come up. One issue that's come up is whether a journal can insist that people who work on the journal take a course it's more like a seminar, I guess, It's called Palestine 101, which is a set of teaching about history of Palestine and the struggle, including the current struggle, including the BDS principles.
Right.
So it seems to me, as an outsider, that those journals have the right to make that decision, just like they want to make any other decision. I'm sure at least some of the journals have adopted programs dealing with implicit bias, whether that deals with race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality, and can insist that people working on those journals take those classes, take those seminars. The issue has come up as to whether the Palestine 101 class requires people to pledge support to the BDS movement. And that is more than studying the BDS movement, and probably raises questions about course requirements that may go further than free speech. It's one thing to study BDS movement. It's another thing to say you cannot be on the staff of this journal unless you pledge to support the BDS movement.
Right.
Another issue which has come up, which is also interesting, is that a journal, in its regulation of content, can, for example, say that we're not going to publish articles that espouse the principles of Zionism. That's outside of the curriculum of our journal. Then the subsidiary question that comes up is, can a journal say we're not going to publish articles written by Zionists? And that's a more difficult question.
Right.
You know, I mean, I could imagine someone who, for example, is a very strong proponent of the political framework of J Street, who upholds the rights of Israel to exist, and so on, writes an article dealing with war crimes in Gaza by the Israeli government. And could you say you're not going to publish that article, regardless of its quality, because the person who wrote it holds views that you could describe as Zionist? So, that's kind of the mess that Dean Chemerinsky has to deal with at this point. Maybe be beyond what we have to deal with tonight.
Actually, we have a really good question, and I'd like to put it for you because it's kind of related to what you just spoke about, what's happening at Berkeley Law, Dan. So here's a question from an audience member, really good question. How does the free speech the UC system promotes overlap with recent communications that assert censorship around topics and issues discussed at grand rounds, which I alluded to earlier? And what is shared on social media related to health equity and social justice, specifically solidarity with Palestinians? So this is kind of gets at the heart of the matter that we're all struggling with throughout the UC system, in the Department of Public Health, at hospitals, at clinics. And this is a real life example that has happened at UCSF more than one time. So do you feel like you can take that on a little bit?
I mean, I can. I think, though, that even at the level that you've shared the question, Jeff, it sounds very general. I mean, you know, we're kind of talking about grand rounds, talking about public health impacts of war.
Yeah.
And it's historically part of that. You can talk about the war in Ukraine, but not you can't talk about the war against
In
Gaza.
Gaza. Yes, that's what's happening.
I mean, that sounds like a content-based description, a content-based prohibition. And the fact that someone may not like it, I don't want to hear about Gaza. I'm okay with Ukraine or Rwanda or some other place in the world, but I don't want to hear about Gaza. Sorry, that's a heckler's veto. You don't get to veto my speech because it's close to something that you care about. And if grand rounds are a place where that sort of content has been allowed, then it becomes an issue of not only censoring content, but unequal treatment.
Wow.
You know, where it gets tricky, and this is where I think the university has a basis for pushing back, is in university policy that prohibits hate speech and or harassment. And university policy, and I'll just read a sentence or two of that: abusive conduct is harassing or threatening behavior that is sufficiently severe, persistent, or pervasive, that denies, adversely limits, or interferes with a person's participation in or benefit from the education, employment, or other programs or activities of the university. And the next sentence is even, I think, more on point. This conduct creates an environment, whether intended or not, that a reasonable person would find to be intimidating or offensive and unrelated to the university's legitimate educational, employment, and business interests. So I can imagine you're on grand rounds and someone says, what's that term that people use? You need to give me a warning,
A trigger warning.
trigger warning, because you're going to talk about Palestine. And you could say, no, I'm not. You know, what I'm going to say is consistent with what I've been saying for years when we've spoken about wars. And in my opinion, talking about the war against Gaza is a reasonable topic for this conversation. And I'm sorry that you are sensitive to this, but a reasonable medical student or intern would not be.
Well, yeah, now this is really good because the follow-up to that, Dan, because you're getting at the heart of the matter in terms of the pushback we're getting at UC and the pushback we're getting at other institutions, which is what UC has done is said things like, well, if you say things that make other people not feel safe, then you can't do it. So people are bringing up these safety concerns all the time. For example, in this question that came up, and this came from an email from a vice chancellor, by the way, who said, we're getting complaints that patients are not feeling safe when they hear that faculty or other people are wearing Free Palestine buttons or talking about Palestine or talking about Gaza. So they're bringing that up as a reason to suppress and not talk about certain things.
In the law, we talk a lot about black line principles.
Yeah.
We talk about gray areas, right? I mean, and I think you're hitting on an issue where we might expect to see lawsuits and court decisions come up. And the question would be, what does a reasonable physician do in circumstances where the content of speech may freak someone out, right? And I would make the argument that in the field of public health, talking about the impact of war, whatever war, any war, is legit. It's legit conversation in a seminar, in a meeting, in a classroom. On the other hand, if the patient is not, being difficult, but really appears to be sensitive to the conversation that's occurring around his or her, what would a reasonable physician do in those situations?
Mm-hmm. Let me make it even more complicated for you. What if a faculty or a student is talking about Palestine or health concerns in Palestine, and a supervisor or a senior faculty person says, "I don't feel safe," or "We can't talk about that"? Not even a patient.
I'm a little hard line on this stuff. If you don't feel safe because we're having a conversation and no one is threatening you explicitly, no one is harassing you, no one is calling you names, no one is saying, you're acting that way because you're a jerk. But if you're really feeling threatened by it, maybe you should take a leave.
Mm.
That's what workers' compensation is for. If your work environment is too stressful for whatever reason, you can take a leave. You can take a day off. You can go see your supervisor and saying, look, these people around here with their Free Palestine buttons are triggering me. I'm about to have a nervous breakdown.
That's not that far away from it.
I mean, and it is difficult, and you have to make judgments. I mean, and this is just me. I don't claim to speak for everybody, but in my view, people take advantage of situations like that. Let's put aside Palestine. Let's say, I hate when people start talking about transgender people and their needs for medical treatment and even surgical intervention. That freaks me out, so, and I can't abide by that conversation. Does that mean you have to shut up and you can't talk about it? And, that's a topic that is coming up all over our society in every kind of educational venue, from, kindergarten and primary school, perhaps all the way up to medical school.
Well, it is. And I'm going to make it even more complicated for you right now, because, there's all this work that's going on in Washington. And then President Drake of the UC system is working on new guidelines for what's I mean, it's crazy that we're talking about it, but he is doing this. What's permissible speech, what's not permissible. And now the attempt, which you know about, to equate anti-Zionism and the criticism of Israel with being de facto anti-Semitic. And this is the thing that's happening a lot right now, because a lot of the protests, a lot of the free speech that we're engaging in is critical of the policies of the state of Israel and the idea of Zionism and its belief in an ethno-national state for Jews only. And criticizing that becomes de facto anti-Semitism. So that in fact are real life things that are happening at the university, in the workplace, at clinics, at hospitals.
And it needs to be, I don't know what else to say besides it needs to be combated, right? And perhaps that's one of the roles that Jewish anti-Zionists play in particular. It's something that I've been arguing about, even with members of my own family, for as long as I can remember. And I was at a forum in Oakland last Sunday at mosque, actually, and someone was giving a program on Palestinian history and talking about the World Zionist Conference in 1897, when Theodore Herzl spoke, and they did a resolution on creating the state of Israel someplace. And I wanted to say, that's wrong. Because my grandfather told me that growing up in Belarus, what's now Belarus, in the 1880s, long before Herzl became active, there were Zionist organizations, and the Zionists and the socialists in the Jewish community debated about what was the best way forward for Jews. Is it socialism or is it Zionism? And those were conversations, I guess, that divided Jewish families going back to the 1880s, long before there was a conversation about establishing the state of Israel where it is, right? And even in the the New York Times yesterday, some guy took out a whole page ad,
right,
kind of echoing the Dreyfus affair and making all these points, one of which was he is insisting on exposing the intellectual dishonesty of people who attempt to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism.
Exactly. And now, I mean, we're in a place, though, Dan, and maybe you can speak to this, where we can criticize the US government freely, actively, openly, but the Congress is getting ready to pass a law basically making it illegal to criticize Israel because it's de facto anti-Semitic. So we're not that far away from that. And that trickles down to the workplace. It trickles down to the University of California. There's a trickle down, and I'm just seeing on the chat here, when that in the House, every single Democrat that voted for a statement basically saying anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism bill, only 2 Congress people didn't vote in favor of it out of the entire Congress.
Wow. Yeah, well.
But you can see what we're up against now at the level of the university, because, and maybe we can open it up more conversationally, because I don't know if did you feel like you were able to speak about your main points? Were there other things you wanted to cover?
I wanted to summarize the UC policies. I feel like I have with very minor exceptions, the same rules that describe speech that may be punished as abusive and harassing applies to student speech as well as faculty speech and staff speech. And I imagine, there are going to be disciplinary proceedings brought against student and faculty, and that will be the issue, right? That will be the issue. Were people harassing, and you cannot equate the content of speech with harassment, right?
Well,
to me,
that's
speech
what's
that is
happening.
harassing or abusive, trying to make one word, is speech that's directed at someone almost as an insult, right?
Or a threat.
Or a threat. It's not just that I disagree with your support of the state of Israel because blah blah blah, but saying you are some rotten, dishonest person, and if I had my way, you'd lose your job or your fellowship and get the hell out of town before we throw you out. I mean, that's the kind of speech that could be punished.
So I'm going to ask a tough question because I know this is on everybody's mind. Your presentation has been really fantastic and really laid out the landscape of all the issues that we're struggling with right now. People are coming down hard on Palestine solidarity activists. They just are. We're feeling it throughout the entire healthcare system. I mean, I don't know how many stories I get every day. My CEO said I couldn't talk about this. We can't have a vigil for the dead Palestinian children in Gaza because it's going to be offensive to people. I mean, we're talking about quiet vigils. Or we can't be critical of the state of Israel because it's anti-Semitic. So what would you suggest all of us in the healthcare sector, in the healthcare world, or at the university, who are part of that system, how do we protect ourselves? What do we do? What steps do we do to maintain our integrity and our belief in what we do and our commitment and our courage to do with what we do, not to be intimidated about it, but also to protect ourselves?
Well, Jess, I think the answer is a political answer. And to me, the summary of that is collective action. Right? I think these government agencies, including these cowardly members of Congress, need to see that people are united and are not going to be intimidated. I mean, to me, that's the lessons of these huge protests in Washington, New York, San Francisco, and even Austin, is that people don't agree with this. People are outraged by what's going on in Palestine, the bombing and the rest of it, and demand that the US government not support it the way Biden and his cabinet have. And that's what, to me, is shocking and unacceptable. And there's lots of things that people can do, and I'm not, I'm an old guy. I was an expert on organizing protests in my 20s and 30s, and I think that the people of that generation are best at figuring out how to mobilize themselves and mobilize their colleagues, and using the media and the internet and the rest of the tools that are available today. But people have to hear it. I mean, I don't know whether Nancy Pelosi was part of that group, or whether she ducked out when the vote came, or
No, she didn't duck out. She voted. She's one of the big supporters.
Well, that it's disappointing, right, that so few stood up. It was amazing to me back in 2001, when, with the exception of Barbara Lee,
right,
the whole Congress voted that it was great for the U.S. to bomb the crap out of Afghanistan. And no one would stand up to that because people were outraged by 9/11.
So I'm gonna like push your political analysis a little bit, and then I'm gonna invite my dear colleagues, Dr. Rupa and Dr. Leigh, to kind of jump into the discussion, because basically what you're saying, Dan, and I think this is kind of an important point, part of what power does through law, the lawfare that they do to say, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, we don't feel safe, criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, you can't talk about that, is to create a climate of fear and intimidation. Not that there's necessarily a strong legal basis for it, but it's a psychological attempt to create fear and anxiety and loathing in people to get them to not speak or to feel anxious or afraid to speak, right?
For sure. There are these huge, for people who have been up to Berkeley Law, if you're walking up Bancroft and you look at the law school, you see these two enormous iron plaques with sayings from Cardozo and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And one of them is this Platonic statement. When I look at the law, I see a princess mightier than all men, or something like that effect. And when I look at the law, I see a mechanism for rationalizing and maintaining the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that the law changes is when the status quo changes. And when MLK led the March on Washington, that was the first time that government got serious about thinking about employment rights, equal employment rights, Title VII. And it wasn't until 17 years after that that women were included in Title VII because of the rise of the women's movement between 1964 and 1981. The March on Washington also generated the Voting Rights Act. So our government officials need to hear from hundreds of thousands of people. Vietnam time, we had teach-ins to change student perception about what was going on in Vietnam. People were successful, and over time, government policy changed. Hopefully, it won't take as long to stop the bombardment of Gaza, but things did change. People
So
like,
you're
Jeffrey Cohalan, who was a loyal LBJ Democrat member of Congress from the East Bay, was challenged 3 times before Ron Dellums finally got over in 1970, at the time of the invasion of Cambodia and the huge protests opposing the invasion of Cambodia.
Yeah. So I think you've really articulated very, very beautifully, Dan, like the legal protections around free speech that we have, and both from the federal and the state level. And basically part of what you're saying is keep doing what you're doing. Mass mobilization, mass work, numbers really make a difference to changing the status quo. With that said, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Rupa, and my colleague, Dr. Leigh, to join the discussion. So let me ask you first, Rupa, based on everything you've heard and everything that you have been through and what you're hearing from your students and your colleagues, what would you like to put into the mix of our discussion?
Thank you so much, Jess, and thank you, Dan. I guess what I'd like to hear from Dan is how you see this moment historically and what gains you think we can make in terms of civil rights and our abilities to speak, given the number of what I consider missteps I'm seeing, at least my own university, the University of California, telling us to behave ourselves, as as hospitals are being bombed and we're witnessing our colleagues, executed in the act of care, and our patients are being killed in their hospital beds. So as we're witnessing this live streaming through social media and then receiving these messages, I've never seen so many people crying at work. I've never seen people at every level of hierarchy within the hospital system, from faculty to students to janitors, pull me into rooms to cry and to like speak in whispers how afraid they are to say anything in the face of this violence. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like this is a moment where the law and the law can play a role here, as it did in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think it can. And, as I'm speaking this evening and listening to people, I mean, I'm thinking of what we have to do on our end, right? Because, I have been active in the National Lawyers Guild since I started law school in 1967. And I was thinking of the things that we did to increase resources. For example, during the protest movement at Cal, Third World Strike in particular, there were lots of students and some faculty members who were being brought up on charges, just like I think students may be now, for going outside the lines and talking about Palestine. We trained law students to be able to represent people in these campus disciplinary hearings so that no student had to go into one of these panels alone. The Guild and others set up draft counseling clinics, again, where mainly law students, but also lawyers, were trained to advise people who were getting notices of induction as to what to do. We set up mass defense organizations when there were lots of arrests. Again, thinking of the Third World Strike at Cal and the one at San Francisco State during the same period, and then following years for People's Park, where there are hundreds and hundreds of people being arrested. And we organized lawyers so that people would have lawyers to represent them in court when they were aligned, lawyers who were aligned with their points of view. And I think today the legal landscape, although it's interesting to see how things shake out, there are many more legal resources available now than there were then. I mean, you think of the ACLU, which has grown tremendously over the last 20 years, has lots of staff all over the country, and they're willing to take on not just individual cases, but big cases. You would go to them and say, well, we need a challenge to what Michael Drake is doing. Let's file a lawsuit. And they would generate lawyers to do that. In San Francisco, there's also the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights,
Right.
which does similar stuff, and which has taken on the city around issues of the rights of homeless people, as well as police misconduct kinds of cases. And they're well staffed. What is interesting to me, and maybe theoretically interesting or maybe practically interesting, is these organizations, not the Guild, but Lawyers Committee and the ACLU, when they do litigation, their model is to partner with private lawyers. So, the ACLU may decide to bring a case, and they'll assign one of their staff lawyers to do it, and then they'll kind of canvass the big law firms, the corporate firms, and say, hey, would you like to partner with us? And that partnership is often hugely advantageous because these law firms have such enormous resources. Well, this may be a harder sell for some of the law firms, right? Because these are the same law firms that represent the big corporations, the banks, the finance companies, the insurance companies, the health companies, and so on. And I imagine that in at least some of these firms, taking on a case that even indirectly champions Palestinian rights will be very controversial, which, from my point of view, is probably a good thing. But it may create some obstacles in certain situations to generating the resources we need.
Leigh,
But maybe people in these law firms, just like people at the hospital, are thinking the same thing that your colleagues are thinking. And maybe they want to do something else besides work for a corporate law firm that backs up the military-industrial complex and U.S. engagement in providing $16 billion worth of arms.
Leigh, let me invite you.
So grateful to you, Jess and Dan. This is really, really helpful. And for me, I'm feeling a lot of kinship with your mic drop about the law changes when the status quo changes and not the reverse, because what we've been witnessing is our institutions and the way power operates in them being behind the status quo, being really violating people's rights and safety. And in medicine, that is, and in law, right, that's very sad, because that promotes violence, it promotes harm to the public health, it promotes harm to health. I don't know if this will be articulate enough to be clear, but I still feel like I am a little bit confused at the intersection of civil rights law and specifically like Title VII and free speech. What we have seen in all of our institutions is this conflation, as Dr. Murray has put in the chat about the resolution, the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which, with a correct analysis really results in the leaders of all of our institutions making them more dangerous, honestly, for all, because of course they're making them more dangerous for Palestinian, Muslim, other students, Arab students, but they're also making it more dangerous for people that are speaking out against Israel, as you discussed. Yet we are accused of making a hostile environment that is violating people's rights. And what do you do when it is actually the leadership of institutions that are creating the discriminatory and unsafe environment for people, people within the environment? So I think just that intersection.
Just for a second.
Yeah, sure.
I can hear you.
Oh, you okay?
Just the intersection of free speech and civil rights, and to Dr. Murray's point, is there a way that we can use this moment to more aggressively protect civil rights and have a different analysis than our institutions are having about who is actually violating people's civil rights?
Leigh, I'm not sure there's an easy answer to your question. I think that where cases will come down is kind of in the gray areas, because some of these principles are so firmly established that it's hard to imagine that we would lose cases on these issues. As a warning, though, one of the little excerpts from a court decision that was at the end of my handout is the Goldberg case, which goes back to the 1960s, and where the California Court of Appeal upheld the punishment of a student based upon the content of his speech. And in retrospect, it seems kind of like an aberration, but at the time it was pretty mainstream. And you know, Art Goldberg's crime was standing up at a rally at Sproul Plaza that was consistent with time, place, and conditions, and chanting things like "fuck the Regents," right? And so he pushed the boundary, and he was punished for it. Although he did become a lawyer and has had a long practice in Echo Park in Los Angeles. But look, if to me, the idea of equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is a lie, right? And people have to stand up and point that out and refuse to go along with it. And we need to pressure not only politicians, but the media to explode that as a lie. But at the end of the day, you have a free speech right to be anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, right? I mean, so this may help temporarily the people on the other side win some of these political battles, but it shouldn't have an impact on the legal resolution of these issues.
Wow. Yeah, because the political discourse on this, I think, is what you're saying, Dan, is just that's one silo, that's one space, and then we have the legal analysis, and they frequently do battle, obviously. I do want to correct myself, and someone rightly pointed out when I said only 2 people voted against this particular bill on anti-Semitism, I confused that with another bill last week, which was a bill on flagging support for Israel, where only 2 people voted against it. The one on anti-Semitism is a little bit, it's still bad, but we had, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 people vote against the equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And I'm not known for defending Nancy Pelosi, but I have to be honest about it. She didn't vote for it. She didn't vote against it. She was not present. So still cowardly, but she didn't vote for it.
Jess, just to clarify, is that because there's 2 bills? The one from last week was 888, and she was present for that. The one that was 894, which was just yesterday.
Yeah.
Was she present or not present? She didn't vote. I'm not sure if she didn't vote for that. Not that it.
She did not vote on it. She was listed as not voting.
Okay.
According to, this is on 88 bills. So there's so many bills in Congress supporting Israel right now. So I get confused about it. Despite everything else that's wrong in the country right now, they're choosing to put this as a higher priority in our Congress. But I want to make sure that when we do say something, it's accurate. And so there's a difference between these 2 bills, and I'm glad we clarified it.
What's odd to me, or noteworthy, let's put it this way, is that it seems that there must have been members of Congress who signed the resolution for the ceasefire who voted for this anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism bill. Because there are 20 some odd members of Congress who had signed up on the ceasefire resolution.
Right. I think people are a little confused in Congress, Dan. I might be overstating that, but
Or paid, and that would be. I mean, I think this is where we need to understand how AIPAC is impacting all this voting and really look at those records. So I guess Dan, like, what are our next steps? So we host a grand rounds. We host a decolonizing medicine talk. So I do a lot of work around specifically analyzing power in society and how that creates health disparities. That's my research. That's what I do. And I've never experienced the kind of blowback I've experienced at UCSF as I have in the last few weeks. And I'm wondering, but I have experienced blowback before. So the content of my speech is often problematic because I'm naming dynamics of power that create poor health in people. And it's fine to talk about health disparities, but not to talk about the structures of power that create those health disparities. And so we want to organize this, and we get told, you know, you can't do this, or this is making people feel unsafe. What are our rights? Can we say we hear that and we're going to continue? This is our scholarly activity. We start giving the presentation and someone calls the cops on us at UCSF, as has happened. Are we, you know, how do we, what are our rights in this scenario?
Well, I think what your rights are depends upon what happens, right? And so, you know, if your dean comes and yells at you and says you're creating a big mess, and you say, sorry, doctor, I don't agree, and I'm going to continue to create that mess, then, you know, your rights haven't been violated. If the police come and arrest you because the dean called the police and you were arrested trying to give a presentation, your rights have been violated and you have a lawsuit. If someone gives you a bad evaluation or doesn't give you a raise that you're entitled to, or tries to impose some kind of disciplinary action. I mean, it's all contextual. And to some extent, people have to, you know, plan, right? I mean, we all grew up knowing about the Montgomery bus boycott, and only a little later in life realized that SCLC and Rosa Parks and the rest of them were at a retreat for several days in Tennessee and planned it all out, and, you know, decided the logistics and what resources they would mobilize to defend themselves and what they would do when the authorities acted as they expected them to act. I think all that is important. I mean, people sometimes get in trouble and maybe they don't mind, right? I'm not saying people shouldn't get in trouble if they don't mind, but sometimes people get in trouble because they haven't planned carefully enough, right?
That's really good advice, Dan. That's really, really good advice. Because basically at this historical moment, which is really extraordinary, and there's no end in sight for the genocide that's happening in Gaza now. The Israeli military has already decided that they're probably going to be there for 6 months. And they just announced today that their plan is to continue to control and occupy even Gaza even further after, quote, the war ends. And I put that in soft quotes. So we're in this for the long haul. This is a marathon. People have heard me say this, you know, a lot. This is not a sprint. This is a marathon. And what you're saying is really important because, you know, we're thinking through how we're going to proceed for the foreseeable future, and we want to do it in a way that can change the space around the status quo about speaking about Palestine. And then specifically in the healthcare space, we will be strong and courageous about speaking about it's never okay to bomb a hospital. It's never okay to kill patients. It's never okay to kill doctors. And we're not going to fear that. We're just not. But we're going to push it. And based on what you said, we have to do our job before we come to you as an attorney. We have to be really good at planning all the contingencies, right?
To the extent to which we can. And you know, what listening to what Jess says really underlines for me that this is not about us, right? This is about people of Palestine and their future. and our ability to impact what especially the US government does, right? We have less influence over the Israeli government, but the US government's our problem.
Right. 100%. We have one, because I'm being mindful of time, so we may take one more question. And this is a question from the audience, who've been great, by the way. I've been told by some people that saying apartheid is anti-Semitic. I've been adamant in my use of the word in the context of human rights organizations reports that describe it. And this is, the reports from B'Tselem, from Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch that have described Israel as practicing apartheid. But we have situations, where people are being, it's that equation of any criticism, including the use of the word apartheid, which they're trying to legalize now to, kind of legally say you can't use apartheid with Israel now. So would you offer anything else in terms of that particular, it's content based, so I think you've addressed some of it, but do you have any thoughts on that?
I criticize myself for being maybe too reluctant to use some language that seems to fit, and particularly genocide and apartheid. For a long time, I was saying, well, I get it what people are saying, but it's not exactly what the Germans did to the Jews. It's not exactly the Holocaust. And it's not exactly South Africa. Okay. But damn it, it's close enough, right? And I think if you want to use the word genocide and feel like it's a word that you can defend in an argument, and it's not just calling names, and same with apartheid, there's plenty of evidence that makes that a rational, reasonable thing to say to people.
Mm-hmm.
That's my personal opinion.
Thank you for that. And we have one last question, or maybe we can take one more after this. Given everything that you've heard from us and everything that you've said so far, if you had to say what your top 3 practical tips are, what would you say?
I'm not such an expert on everything that needs to be done, but the point I tried to make about collective action, I think, is an important one. Organize. I mean, one of the things that those of us in the anti-Vietnam War movement learned in the 60s is, multiple tactics, right? Multiple tactics. People have to be engaged at their comfort level, and hopefully their comfort level expands as time goes on. But I don't think it's a waste of time to have a petition and have people sign it. I don't think it's a waste of time to be involved in electoral campaigns and knock on people's doors and urge them to vote for candidates who are better on these issues. I think mass meetings, mass protests, teach-ins, I think, are important. That meeting I was talking about at the mosque in Oakland on Sunday, and I was mistaken. It wasn't this, time is rushing by. It wasn't this past Sunday. It was the Sunday before. I mean, there were 1,000 people there at this mosque for a meeting that started at 10 o'clock in the morning and went to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And the educational panels were jammed up. I mean, people wanted to hear what other people wanted to say. So I think education is critical, and I think we have to be brave. I mean, everybody's going to have to figure out what that meant. The draft was a big part of the war in Vietnam, and tens of thousands of young men refused to be drafted.
Right.
They went to the induction center and they said, okay, come forward and raise your hand and speak the oath. People didn't. And it got to be somewhere between a farce and a joke. But the draft wasn't working because so many people were ultimately influenced and decided that their individual point of resistance to Vietnam was not to join the military. So during Occupy, there were big debates about diversity of tactics. And I think that's important too.
That's really good advice. This is a pretty good question, and I've heard this from a number of physicians. And I wonder if you could speak to this. It's maybe a little outside of your expertise, but some of the people that are working with us and doing solidarity work are actually non-American physicians who are here on various kinds of visas. And there's a lot of anxiety among those individuals about speaking up because there's been threats coming from senators and Congress folks who are saying anyone who speaks out against Israel who's not a citizen should be deported. I mean, they've said that. So I wonder if you have any advice to people who are here on visas and not citizens.
You know, I know very little about immigration law, and we have friends who are expert. I mean, look, I have not ever heard of or learned of professionals being deported because of their political activity. But it's hard to say, right? I mean, hard to say what will happen. You read all these articles now about how if Trump were to be reelected, a lot of things that people take for granted would no longer be there to take for granted. And he talks about deporting everybody who's not a citizen. So I don't know, you know, I mean, I think that there's a risk. At 2023, there's probably not a lot of risk, but we'll see what happens as time goes on.
Great. Dr. Rupa, Dr. Leigh, anything else before we give our deep appreciation to Dan Siegel and to our community that's joining us tonight? Any closing remarks that you guys would like to make?
I guess one of my concerns in my role as a faculty member is just how I advise. I mean, I can take the risks I take, but when I have residents and students coming to me with their concerns, it's just dicier to know, you know, I want to support their desires to express themselves and their really correctly identifying the impediments to health equity. So they're making what I consider correct diagnoses, and I want to support that. However, can you give me any tips on how to support, like what are the best ways to support them if they're worried about their rights? And I'll definitely share the documents you made for us, but in a nutshell, what I'm hearing from you is we're in gray territory. That's what I'm hearing. You know, under the Trump days, we heard a lot of people feeling unsafe and using unsafety as lack of safety as a way to argue for various legal positionalities. And so that's what we're hearing right now from our institutions, that's saying, you know, Palestine should be free, or the occupation should end, or apartheid should end, or genocide should end, that these things are threatening. They threaten people. And so I'm just wondering if you could help me understand how to best support students and residents.
May I just piggyback on that, Rupa, is to say that, Dan, I so appreciated you describing how maybe we need a mass movement of resources again. And so to just piggyback on that, I am feeling, as Rupa has said, that I do not have the resources or the judgment or the correct information to support all the people that are coming to me, or all the cases I read about, 3 UCI students recently, being brought up for disciplinary hearings. So if there are practical tips that you think we should be advocating for to get legal resources to support our students and trainees, along with this advice that Rupa's asking about too, that would be helpful.
It's really hard, and I appreciate the pressure that Rupa is expressing to help people make the right decisions, right? And what we can do, a couple things we can do, is we can make sure there's accurate information out there so that people know what the rules are, or at least what the rules are today, realizing the rules may be different tomorrow. We can mobilize resources. I mean, I'm pretty confident that we can mobilize the legal resources that people need, whether they're facing campus hearings in Irvine or San Diego or San Francisco, or legal proceedings. But at the end of the day, right, again, it's a question of what's your individual comfort with risk. And that's kind of where I was saying earlier, sign a petition, sign a letter, go to a meeting, knock on your neighbor's doors, and maybe someday, way in the future, you'll take the risk of being arrested or being brought up on disciplinary charges. But people have to make the individual decisions. Again, I go back to the people in Gaza and the West Bank, and they have to make decisions about what they do. And hopefully they have the ability to make decisions because the situation allows them to make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're in a hospital that's being bombed, you don't have much decision-making power.
Right.
That's all I can say.
Well, let me jump in and just say how deeply appreciative we are of you, Dan, and giving of your time today. How appreciative we are of your long history and commitment to civil rights, to free speech, and what looks like to be almost a 50-year commitment to Palestine in some way or another. So, your giving of your time today says a lot about you, and we see that, we feel it, and we really appreciate it so very much. And I know I'm speaking for all of the colleagues who are watching this now, and all of our colleagues who will be watching it in the future, because this is going to be an in-demand presentation. I'm sure it's going to be watched quite a bit. And I'm sure you're going to be hearing from us in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this. I just want to say in my own defense, I appreciate the appreciation, but I feel as a person extremely grateful that I've been able to live my life doing things that I believe in and want to do. And so, I'm a lucky person, and I will continue to help out as much as I can.
Really appreciate that. So to all of you who are watching, we're gonna let our IT support folks, you guys can sign off. The people on the panel are just gonna stay on for a few minutes afterwards to close up things. But I want to thank all of you for all the work you're doing as a Palestine healthcare worker solidarity activists. We deeply appreciate that. I know that my community from here in the diaspora all the way to Palestine really deeply appreciates the work that you're doing. in committing yourself to. And we'll definitely be in touch with all of you. So thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, I think that's it. Let me just, yeah, everybody else is, looks like everybody else is signing off. Hey, Dan, that was great, man. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jess. Great to meet you all, Leigh and Rupa, and I look forward to talking again very soon.
Yeah, we're going to do that. And just again, to get your permission, you're okay if I'll send you a link to this video. So if you want to share it, you're obviously, I mean, you're the guest speaker, and we'll probably be sharing it more widely in terms of people who may be not able to see it live with us. So I hope you're okay with that too.
I'm fine. I'm fine with it.
Dan,
Rupa,
and I'll be seeing you on